In the summer of 2004, 19-year-old college student Phillip Thompson accepted a dare from his friends to spend a week as a night guard at a mental institution. The Asylum, infamous for its dark history and the legend of the Whisperer, held a personal connection for Phillip, as his uncle had been a patient there several years earlier. What happened during his time at the asylum was both terrifying and life-altering. This is the story Phillip told his psychiatrist, Dr. Samantha Reeves, during a session after his harrowing ordeal.
I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the asylum, not knowing what to expect. As soon as I entered the place, it felt like the air had thinned out, letting the musty smell of old paperwork and stale air hit me like a wave. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. It wasn't the light, but the shadows it cast that made me feel not alone. Someone approached me to say something, but when I turned around, it was just the lights, casting shadows. I adjusted my new security guard uniform, the starched fabric stiff against my skin. "Phillip Thompson reporting for duty," I said to the bored-looking receptionist who looked familiar. She barely looked up from her outdated computer screen as she handed me a set of keys and a radio. "Third floor, east wing," she droned. "Watch out for the crazies." I tried to ignore the uneasiness that settled in my gut. I needed this job. After all the trouble at my last job, I was sure no one would ever hire me again. It was only for a week, but at least it was something. With Dad's medical bills piling up, I couldn't afford to be picky. Besides, my friends had dared me to stick it out for the full 7 days. $50 from each of them. How could I say no to that? What they didn't know is how much my dad needed it. But there was no way I was going to tell them. As I climbed the creaking stairs to the third floor, I realized I was lost. This was the wrong third floor. I was meant to start 3 floors underground. I turned around and started going down the 6 stories to the 3rd level basement. No wonder the position was open, I thought. Little did I know that the horror I was about to experience had not even begun. My Uncle Jack had been a patient here years ago. Then he vanished without a trace. Mom never liked to talk about it, but I knew something strange had happened to him within these walls. How could they just lose a patient? It didn't add up. But that's the thing about people in these places. They're already invisible. Maybe my connection to Uncle Jack is the reason I've always been drawn to this place, despite its dark reputation. I finally reached the east wing and unlocked the heavy metal door, the keys jingling in my hand. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit and silent except for the occasional muffled moan or whisper from behind closed doors. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward. The cold air prickling my skin, the halls of the asylum seemed to go on forever. Each corridor identical to the last, and full of untraceable movements and moans, a labyrinth of the unknown. As I walked, my footsteps echoed off the bare walls, mingling with the distant sounds of groans and whispers. I couldn't tell if the sounds were coming from the patients' rooms or somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far away, and yet impossibly close. I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye that disappeared when I looked in that direction. It was familiar, like someone in particular, but it wasn't immediately recognizable. It must have been all those flickering fluorescent lights. Then suddenly it lit up the wall next to me. In the blink of an eye, I saw it. The words, "Susurro ad est." I had no idea what those words meant, but there they were, clear as day on that solid gray wall. I walked faster. Eager to get away from those strange words, my heart began to race. It would be rather embarrassing to call myself a night watchman and be afraid of the crazies, but I couldn't deny that I didn't like anything about it. I kept walking up the hall and then I realized something. I couldn't hear my footsteps or my heartbeat. I couldn't hear anything. Silence surrounded me. Complete silence. As I tried to make sense of it, the silence was pierced by this low moan that seemed to vibrate in my ears. Then I felt something brush against my neck. I swear to God, I almost jumped out of my skin and I tapped my neck to try to knock whatever it was off of me. But nothing was there. Suddenly, my footsteps and heartbeat came back louder than ever. They were all I could hear, pounding in my head. As I quickly turned a corner, a certain room caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar and a faint light spilled into the hallway. Something about it called out to me, piquing my curiosity. And I just wanted to get away from this creepy corridor. I hesitated for a moment, knowing I shouldn't pry where I wasn't meant to, but the urge was too strong to resist. As I approached, the lights went out for what seemed like an eternity, but must have only been a few seconds. Because then I felt the rush of wind as a door swung open and someone grabbed me. I thought it was a nurse. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, clamped over my mouth from behind. A muffled scream ripped from my throat as I was pulled backward. A rasping whisper tickled my ear. Not quite words. More like dry wind rustling dead leaves. It somehow freed me and I was able to close the door and lock it with a master key. The air felt thick where the hand had been. I couldn't stop my fingers from tracing the invisible mark around my mouth. It felt icy there, as icy as the hand had felt, and I shivered. I didn't know what had just happened. It's hard to explain, but I put it down to being in that place. I tried to shake off what had happened and left the room. Another room in front of me was also open. How did the staff survive this every day? I had to continue my round, so I walked on and came to the next open door with light coming out of it. It was an old office. At that moment, with all the fights I was so good at having with my coworkers at my last job, I had really wished that someone was working with me on this floor right now. But there was no one in the room. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The room was small and cramped, filled with dusty filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. I ran my fingers over the labels, looking for a name that might jump out at me. And there it was. Thompson Jack. It was easy to find. Too easy, in a way. I felt uneasy. But still, with trembling hands, I pulled out the file and began to read. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and strange diagrams, and there it was. Cicero adist. The same phrase I'd seen on the wall. None of it made sense to me. But one phrase kept coming up. The Whisperer. The Whisperer watches. The Whisperer knows everything. The Whisperer is here. According to the file, the Whisperer would appear mostly in my uncle's dreams. I searched another file, and this too had the Whisperer mentioned in it. The file mentioned how it spoke to them in their dreams, promising them power and knowledge in exchange for their sanity. Some had even claimed to see it, describing it as a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and a voice like honey. An icy wave of cold air washed over me, breaking my concentration. And as I realized how much I needed this job, the rational part of my mind told me it was just a bunch of nonsense. It was the ravings of disturbed minds, and the strange things that happened to me were due to exhaustion and my overactive mind. But something about it felt all too real, like a half-remembered nightmare lurking just beyond the edges of my consciousness. I shoved the files back into the cabinet and hurried out of the room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. But I had a job to do, and I couldn't let my imagination run wild. But as I continued my rounds, I could feel the icy throbbing on my mouth where that hand had been. What more there was to this place than met the eye. The sensation of spinning intensified as it became harder to keep my composure in the dimly lit hallway. My vision began to blur at the edges. I began to see shadows everywhere. But through all this confusion, I kept seeing the words, Susuro adest. Not only on the wall, but on the crusty windowsill, smudged on the ceiling, and somehow written on my own hand in Sharpie, in shaky handwriting. I must have written it while reading the file, though I don't remember doing it. Finally, I reached out, my hand finding support on the rough, cold concrete wall. I leaned heavily against it, trying to steady myself, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. My legs buckled under me, and I slid down the wall, coming to rest on the dusty floor. I had to compose myself, and this was the only way I could think of. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the dizzying kaleidoscope of horrifying images dancing behind my eyelids. My mind raced, thoughts jumbled together in a chaotic mess. My uncle's disappearance, the asylum's dark history, the whispers of something sinister lurking within these walls. It all swirled together. A whirlpool of fear and confusion. My fingers worked the phone by themselves. I had to know. What did those words mean? Susuro adest. Latin. It means the whisperer is here. Despite my best efforts to stay awake, to keep my wits about me, I felt myself slipping away. I needed to get my bearings, and perhaps a moment's rest would do just that. However, there was no real decision to be made, as the pull of unconsciousness was too strong. I sank into a restless slumber, the asylum fading away. In my dreams I was lost, wandering through a twisted version of the asylum. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating with an unnatural life of their own. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and I could hear whispers. Sinister, unintelligible murmurs that sent shivers down my spine. These whispers, they were vibrating off the walls. They were calling to me. Words I heard but couldn't translate. Suddenly I jolted awake, my heart pounding in my chest, a scream caught in my throat. For a moment I didn't know where I was, the nightmare still clinging to the edges of my consciousness. But as I shook my head awake, my eyes adjusted to the dusty darkness. The familiar corridors of the asylum came into focus. As I pushed myself up from the floor, my legs still shaky, a glint of something caught my eye. Tucked into a crack in the dusty wall was a small leather-bound journal with a brass clip. It would have been easy to overlook and think it was just a part of the wall peeling away, but somehow it called out to me as if I was destined to find it. Curiosity getting the better of me, I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first page was dated over 2 decades ago, and the handwriting was painfully familiar. I turned the pages with a shaking hand, reading more and more of the experiences. He wrote of a presence that drove him mad. He called it the Whisperer. It taunted him. It never left him alone. As far as I could tell, that was exactly what was happening to me. I flipped through the pages, his words beginning to sink in as I read. Most of it was unintelligible. And then there it was, page after page of 2 words scrawled over and over again. The Whisperer. As I read it, I saw a flinting shadow in front of me, and then I heard the echoing scream. I jumped in fright, shoved the journal into my pocket, and ran. I told myself it was all in my head. Besides, I was still on the clock and I had to get back to some semblance of work. As I dashed through the door to the common room, I found a maze of patients. Some trapped, rocking back and forth, others out of bed throwing things at other patients. This place didn't need a security guard. It needed a whole staff of professionals. Was this what I had signed up for? Who was running this place? I never got the secretary's name, but there had to be some kind of mistake. He's here. The Whisperer is here, a patient screamed, clawing at his own face. Even in this chaos, the job came first. I had to at least try to calm them, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal